Hello and welcome virtually to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Christopher Stans and I'm here to introduce a terrific discussion of nature-based solutions and Indigenous voices, some early lessons from Canada. Our panelists today are both experts that I'm really eager to hear from. Mr. Tyson Atleo is the hereditary chief in line of the Ahusat Nation, hope I got that right, and the Natural Climate Solutions Program Director for Nature United, where he heads Nature United's work advancing nature-based strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through its Natural Climate Solutions Program. He started at Nature United in 2016 as Community Economic Development Lead, integrating economic development into its conservation work along the Emerald Edge, a 100 million acre landscape that stretches from Washington State up the British Columbia coast to Southeast Alaska. Joining Mr. Atleo is Dr. Judith Walcott. Judith Walcott is Senior Safeguard Specialist in the Nature-Based Solutions Unit team at the UN Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center. That's UNEPWCMC. She's the center's lead for UN REDD program work within the UNEP, all these acronyms, and has led multi-year projects focused on forests, climate change, and sustainable development in Latin America. Judith specializes in environmental and social safeguards and supporting countries to access high-integrity financing opportunities for climate change mitigation. She's the lead author of a recently launched report, Making Good on the Glasgow Climate Pact, a call to action to achieve 1 gigaton of emissions reductions from forests by 2025. 1 gigaton, that is, I think, the definition of huge. Judith, let me start with you. Can you tell us a little bit, it's the most basic question of all, what are nature-based solutions? And could you give some examples from your work?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion. It's great to be here with you and also with Tyson to discuss this important topic. So talking about nature-based solutions, it's important to recognize that there's now a multilaterally agreed definition of nature-based solutions. So the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA, sorry to add another acronym, in its 5th session in 2022 adopted a definition of nature-based solutions, which is quite wordy, but I'll give it a try and then I'll try to break it down a little bit. So the definition that was adopted is nature-based solutions are actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use and manage natural or modified terrestrial, freshwater, coastal and marine ecosystems which address social, economic and environmental challenges effectively and adaptively while simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, resilience and biodiversity benefits. So what do we mean by this? I think it's important to recognize that nature-based solutions involve working with the natural world to address a range of social, economic, and environmental challenges and have 3 main elements. They work with different types of ecosystems, so from forests to wetlands, farmlands, urban ecosystems. They also work with ecosystems in 3 main ways, through ecosystem conservation, restoration, and management. Another key aspect of this definition is that nature-based solutions are solution-oriented. They aim to address a range of different social, economic, and environmental challenges, which could include inequality, unemployment, disaster risk, land degradation, climate change, and biodiversity loss. What does this agreed definition allow us to do? So when companies or countries claim that their actions are supporting nature-based solutions, now having this agreed definition helps us to ensure that there's consensus and that companies and governments are actually doing what they say they should be doing. And there's sort of a follow-up on that. I think some examples of nature-based solutions, well, I'll try to give one from the work that I do on forest-based climate solutions, where I've been working for the past almost 10 years. So thinking about actions in forests that either protect, sustainably manage, or restore forests, these are an example of nature-based solutions that can deliver cost-effective climate change mitigation at scale. So these actions can help reverse declines in biodiversity, they can enhance resilience to climate change, they can support local livelihoods and a range of other ecosystem services, soil protection, provision of fresh water, etc. I think it's very, very important to recognize as well that Indigenous peoples and local communities are recognized as the most effective stewards of forests, and they often play a very key role in achieving these outcomes for nature-based solutions. So in this case as well, forest-based actions have a really key contribution to help meet international and global national ambitions, such as in the Paris Agreement. They have potential to provide nearly 30% of the solution to help avert climate catastrophe. Just very briefly, some other examples include protecting or restoring coastal ecosystems, which can reduce vulnerability of communities and infrastructure, and also sequester carbon. So restoration can also contribute to climate change mitigation. So just breaking down the definition, the important thing to remember about nature-based solutions is that only activities and good practices that genuinely support ecosystem resilience and also benefit biodiversity should be considered nature-based solutions.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit at the UN level, since you work, you have a window on the world through the United Nations Environment Program? How are these things being talked about? Is this a European, North American idea? Has it gone global? And do you see it as just the latest buzzword in the climate change debate, or maybe as something of a silver bullet that could help us make big gains?
It's a really interesting question. So tracing back the history a little bit of the concept of nature-based solutions, it really started to gain traction a couple of years ago with IUCN's work on a global standard for nature-based solutions. So why was this developed? This was recognizing that nature is essential for human existence and also for good quality of life. And if you don't recognize this, then you're promoting economic growth models that can contribute to biodiversity loss, but also you miss opportunities to really use nature to help resolve some of the major challenges that we're facing as society: climate change, food security, disaster risk. So working with ecosystems rather than just relying on conventional engineered solutions, for example, can help communities adapt. Using nature can help to green cities, resulting in energy savings and health benefits. So this discussion has made it through to the recent climate change, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity conventions of the parties as well. There have been cover decisions and key texts which discuss and make reference to nature-based solutions specifically, which I think is very important to note. So it's very much on the global level. There's a growing consensus on this. And I think rather than being a silver bullet, nature-based solutions are a useful framework for governments, for businesses, and for others to help meet global challenges, including the climate change, biodiversity, and pollution crises in a way that also benefits people in nature.
So one part of a larger scheme of measures that we need to address climate change. Thank you very much. Tyson Atleo, you direct the Natural Climate Solutions Program for Nature United, the Canadian affiliate of the global conservation organization Nature Conservancy, which some of our viewers will be familiar with. How are nature-based solutions being applied in Canada? And could you give us some examples from your perch in British Columbia?
Would be happy to, Chris. Thanks for the question and thanks for having me today. And many thanks to the team working behind the scenes to ensure that this is a successful event. Judith, really appreciated your opening comments. Usually I'm the person asked to provide an overview of what nature-based climate solutions are, and really happy to have had your expert defining of that for us today. Although I would argue perhaps that the Nature Conservancy was a pioneer globally in coining the phrase natural climate solutions. Actually, it was a 2017 paper co-authored by the Conservancy that identified NCS as a strategy for addressing up to 30% of the globe's emissions by 2030. And then we followed that in Canada in 2021 with a Natural Climate Solutions in Canada paper, which was the lead author is a colleague of mine, Dr. Ronnie Drever, a forest ecologist working as the lead scientist for Nature United in Canada, amongst his colleagues at the Nature Conservancy, Dr. Susan Cook-Patton, and 38 other leading experts from academia, government, and non-government organizations in Canada and the U.S. looked at natural climate solutions in Canada and the potential for natural climate solutions in Canada. And it yielded ambitious but very realistic results, representing achievable potential, rather than maximum possible potential. So introducing some of those safeguards that Judith is an expert in particular, social and economic safeguards. For example, not assuming harvest yields reduced beyond kind of the current status quo required to, feed the world, for example, is very important when considering natural climate solutions. And they're very vital to meeting not only Canada's but global targets related to protecting 30 by 30 and achieving net zero by 2050. And so in Canada specifically, the report suggests that we can cut Canada's emissions by up to 78 megatons annually in 2030, which represents approximately 11% of Canada's annual emissions, as compared to 30% around the world for NCS. And that looks like taking all vehicles in Canada off the road for a year, or powering every home in Canada for up to 3 years. And so the idea here is that natural climate solutions can be very cost effective, with many pathways available at less than $50 a ton, and that they're available now. Some of them are available now, pathways that not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but generate significant co-benefits. And so the paper in Canada looked at 24 different pathways, primarily focused on mitigation, of course. For us, natural climate solutions is focused on mitigation and less so adaptation, but there is kind of a Venn blending of the two for certain pathways. So 24 different pathways in Canada across 4 different ecosystem types, which are very straightforward. You have agricultural lands, particularly croplands. You have forested lands, you have grasslands, and you have wetlands, which is a combination of freshwater and marine, and inclusive of peatlands as well. So the focus in Canada has been on emissions reduction, because the idea here that natural climate solutions are, as the name suggests, a climate solution. And so specifically for ensuring that we're leveraging the value of nature to combat the current state of the climate crisis. And so this is also an acknowledgement of the climate crisis. And as long as we're establishing that baseline, we need strategies to addressing that. Natural climate solutions also have the potential to yield significant co-benefits, which I know that we'll talk a lot more about in the conversation today. It's a particular piece of this work that I'm quite passionate about. And so there are a variety of different approaches, as mentioned, 24 different pathways. The work that Nature United and the Nature Conservancy are doing in Canada primarily focuses on several, including improved forest management. And so old growth protection, for example, in British Columbia is a very hot political topic. There's a lot of public interest in these outcomes, and we're actually seeing a significant shift in the forest sector. And so both Judith and I have quite the background in forest management, and I'm sure that participants here will get a great deal of value out of discussing that as a focus point today. So improved forest management is actually what old growth protection looks like. It's less so protecting and setting aside, which refers mostly to avoiding the conversion of intact forest systems. And actually protecting old growth is within the context of improved forest management, where we're actually setting aside old growth stands or certain age classes within an existing forest management plan. That might be transitioning from a certain cut to another type of cut, or from a certain forest management plan to another forest management plan. These are natural climate solutions. Further, in Canada, we have major commitments from the government around the planting of 2 billion trees. So afforestation, of course, which must come with significant safeguards, especially biodiversity safeguards. To put it really simply, you cannot be planting certain types of trees in certain places, because that might result in significant failure on our part of contributing to biodiversity outcomes. As a basic example, there's been a strong land ethic in Canada in the agriculture sector for many years, and there's a strong adoption of no-till practices, which is an example of an existing natural climate solution long since before natural climate solutions was coined as a phrase. And so we have a lot of examples from the agricultural community as well as from indigenous communities of natural climate solutions being around for a very long time. So no-till, cover cropping, other examples in the cropland sector. And then we have others in wetlands and grasslands, in particular in Canada, avoiding the conversion of native grasslands to croplands or to feed is of significant potential due to how native grasslands store soil carbon. And the same goes for peatlands, which we don't have a strong presence with in Canada yet as an organization, but there are many Indigenous communities concerned about this, especially in northern communities, about ensuring that our peatlands remained undisturbed. Disturbing releases significant emissions. So 24 different pathways in Canada. We're working on several, of course, very closely with the governments, the Crown governments, Indigenous communities, and other NGO partners. But there's a lot more that we can do. Developing tools to support the enabling conditions for the advancing of natural climate solutions are critical. This might look like carbon protocols, for example. And at the outset, I want to be sure that we're clear that carbon offset credits aren't themselves natural climate solutions. It is the natural climate solutions practice that may result in the economic outcome of a carbon credit being generated and verified and sold on the marketplace, but they are not synonymous. That carbon is a tool we can use to enable the adoption of natural climate solutions practices. And we can talk more about that later. So there are a lot of tools we need to develop to enable the adoption of natural climate solutions. We have strong government commitment to funding, although, as usual, there's a lacking in the degree of adequacy, but we need the private sector to step up. There's a role for everyone to play in the adoption of natural climate solutions.
Well, thank you for that overview. And I want to pick up on one thing. I first encountered nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions in dialogue with one of the supporters of our work at the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, Newmont, which is a mining company. A lot of what you said linked natural climate solutions to this idea of stewardship of the land and forests and so forth. But in the mining sector in particular, or I guess I would say resource extraction, how can this approach work? Is it mainly mitigation? Is it partly adaptation? Is it something even beyond that?
So for us in Canada, natural climate solutions are specifically focused on emissions reductions using the protect, manage, restore hierarchy that Judith mentioned as well. And so we actually haven't looked at the potential for that sector through its operations to actually be yielding natural climate solutions results. Perhaps if mining is resulting in the conversion of natural systems like peatlands that store significant amounts of organic carbon, or if they are resulting in the conversion of existing forested lands, then we might consider those to be natural climate solutions. And we can look at our basic framework for determining where that applies and where that doesn't apply. But you made a very important point together earlier that NCS are not the silver bullet for climate issues, that all sectors have a role to play in decarbonizing writ large, and that's critical. And so might a sector like the mining sector look at their scope 1 or 3 emissions and find pathways to addressing those and making certain climate commitments that they might offset, for example, or change business practices and adapt to. These are the responsibilities of the corporate sector, and we heard loud and clear at the biodiversity COP in Montreal in Canada in late 2022 that there's significant responsibilities for all corporate sectors to participate in decarbonizing, of course, and where possible, adopting natural climate solutions. So I would certainly challenge the mining sector to conduct the necessary analysis to determine exactly what role they can play in supporting the adoption of natural climate solutions. Obviously, there are organizations out there willing to help with that. And in addition, it has to be said that, where these actual activities are taking place on the ground in rural communities or otherwise in Canada, and we'll talk about this, of course, today, there is a necessity to engage with respect and responsibility local and Indigenous communities in the development of such activities so that their interests can be accounted for, accountable to, and reflected in business practice. I have personal experience negotiating in this sector in particular, and can assure you that things can always be done better. So that's what I would say about that sector this time. Perhaps Judith has something else she would add, but that's my overview.
Well, Judith, I'd love to get you in on this, and I'm going to maybe make the question a bit more pointed. when you're looking at this, what are the metrics that are useful in assessing projects implementing nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions? In other words, how do we know a good project design incorporating these solutions from a project whose developers just kind of grabbed the label and stuck it on?
Thanks for the question, and thanks also, Tyson, for sharing some of the fantastic experiences from Canada, from Nature United and the Nature Conservancy. So as I mentioned before, to be considered nature-based solutions, there needs to be genuine support to ecosystem resilience, as well as benefits for biodiversity. So there's a number of different standards and tools that have been developed or that are emerging that can help governments and businesses to ensure that the interventions they're designing are in fact nature-based solutions. And I'm sure the Nature Conservancy as well has very useful tools for this. I'm just going to give an example from IUCN, which has developed a global standard as well as guidance that has 8 criteria, which they consider to be appropriate and can be quite useful in assessing whether, in fact, a project is a nature-based solution. So first of all, it would need to clearly identify the societal challenge to which the solution will respond. The intervention should be designed in terms of spatial consideration, so looking at a landscape approach, so a broader design of the intervention. There should be considerations of sustainable development approaches that take account of environmental sustainability, social equity, as well as economic viability. Trade-offs should be considered in natural resource management, which take account of both long and short-term needs. So making decisions as well as full transparency among affected stakeholders to actually have sort of full and deep discussions about what those trade-offs are and how the nature-based solution intervention or actions can be planned accordingly is very important. It's necessary to have adaptive management. I think keeping track of lessons learned, different approaches, what's working well, what isn't, making adjustments along the way is also something very important. And mainstreaming international policies. Tyson again mentioned, the Canada example, and I think it's very important to see that a number of countries are starting to include nature-based solutions specifically in their nationally determined contributions. So how different governments will meet the commitments that they've made for reducing emissions for the Paris Agreement, for example. So making sure that interventions are not just taking place in isolation, but rather have some sort of coordinated, integrated approach as well is quite important. So I think these criteria just give some general guidance to help assess whether or not it is in fact a nature-based solution. Oh,
excellent. Sorry, slow. I was slow on unmuting, but thank you very much for that answer, which I appreciate. I guess maybe I've been in Washington too long, and my first thought is the appeal of nature-based solutions is it's such a policymaker win-win because they get to do development projects, things that they want to see built, and they get credit for being environmentally conscious. What's needed to ensure that any potential negative impacts are taken into account and addressed? Like, if we're looking at this, we've heard the phrase, we see the politicians are doing it, they get to do their development project, whatever it is. How do we make sure that we're monitoring that environmental component and that that all parties are living up to those commitments?
This is a really important question, and I think I'll try to build on some of the examples that Tyson gave in my response. So nature-based solutions has potential to achieve benefits for people, nature, and climate, but they could also present certain risks depending on how an intervention is planned, how it's implemented, how local communities are consulted upon, how it's monitored and followed up on. That's why it's very important that safeguards are considered. And I think this is something Tyson also mentioned very specifically as well. And these can help to either avoid or mitigate risks and negative impacts, but can also promote benefits. I think it's interesting to look at the history of the word safeguards. It was originally associated with, for example, the banking sector, which was looking to avoid risks in its interventions. But I think it's since taken on a much broader meaning. particularly in terms of nature-based solutions, and the area I work in, and where Tyson works quite closely as well in terms of the forest sector. So in addition to avoiding potential impacts for people and nature, having strong safeguards in place can actually help to promote co-benefits, additional benefits for people and nature. So I think that's very important to ensure that there are win-wins. So I think Tyson gave a great example of, not simply converting a natural grassland to another use, because that natural grassland will have unique biodiversity, capacity to store, capture and filter water. People can use and access different natural resources related to that. And I think you can also look at the example of not cutting down a natural forest to have a forest plantation, thinking, well, that could possibly sequester more carbon, but actually you're losing a lot of biodiversity. There could be local communities, Indigenous peoples, depending on the natural forest. So, you need to look at things more holistically, and certainly make sure that interventions are planned very much with consultation, participation from the very beginning with local communities, Indigenous peoples, and with free, prior, and informed consent as appropriate. So I think that consultation process, that participation, making sure that actions reflect the needs, priorities, uses of land and natural resources of the different actors, are gender responsive, consider different aspects related to intergenerational use of lands, and also that there's transparency and access to information when these interventions are being planned, that people know what's happening in their area or the actions that are taking place that could possibly affect them or their use of land. I think these are all very important aspects of safeguards that could be taken into account when planning nature-based solutions and implementing them. There's also been calls more broadly for different safeguards and standards to be put in place to guide nature-based solution design and implementation. In fact, the UNEA, the United Nations Environment Assembly resolution, actually calls for the respect of social and environmental safeguards in line with the 3 Rio conventions, and to also include safeguards for Indigenous peoples and local communities. In the COP decision text from the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity, there's also very specific mention of safeguards as well. I think, having that more holistic planning and implementation is very important to make sure that there is in fact a win-win, and that negative impacts are taken into account and planned and addressed from the very beginning to ensure that safeguards are in place and effects are mitigated, avoided, reduced.
I'm going to jump back to Mr. Atleo, but I wanted to remind our viewers that if you're watching this live, you're able to put questions in to the Wilson website, and we'll get to those very shortly. But I wanted to make sure I brought one other dimension of this problem in. Mr. Atleo, you're a member of one of Canada's Indigenous First Nations, the Ahousaht Nation. I had my researchers suggest a better pronunciation than the one I had at the top of the broadcast. And the Ahousaht historic territories are in British Columbia. Many of us from outside Canada, particularly in the United States, have taken note of First Nations protests and activism on big resource projects, and there have been similar protests in the United States among American, or I guess U.S. based Indigenous peoples. Now, I completely understand you don't want to generalize and speak for all Indigenous peoples. That's putting too much on you. But in terms of your experience and in talking with communities, how is the discourse around natural climate solutions being viewed in Indigenous communities? How would you characterize the response? Is it something that's welcomed, or is it something that maybe just seems like a new buzzword, a new thing, but not necessarily a substantive in terms of real participation?
Quite the question. You are right that I literally cannot, of course, accurately represent the perspectives of Indigenous peoples writ large. I have an experience that comes very specifically from one First Nation community, and I'll give a bit of background on that. But to your question, how are they viewed? It often is viewed as a buzzword until those who are sharing the opportunity have built the relationship, and it exists such that there is trust and understanding in the mutual opportunity presented by natural climate solutions that may benefit the community in terms of their economic opportunities or diversification, but also as a reflection of their values and principles in decision making for and about natural resources. And the other party that are coming forward with these opportunities, or presenting these opportunities or this approach. To many Indigenous peoples, the idea of having to name natural climate solutions, I'm going to go off script here a little bit, is completely absurd, right? Because it's out of the cultural context. It's obviously natural systems provide for us everything that we need to live. And it's kind of the Western industrialized world that has forgotten that, whereas Indigenous peoples have, in many cases, not in all cases, and maybe not Indigenous peoples themselves, because there are many different Indigenous peoples in this world, and many in my own home community that would share a spectrum of perspective on this, but our cultures unequivocally acknowledge the value that natural systems to provide for us, the lands and the waters on which we depend for living a good life. And it's our cultures historically that provided the framework within which we as human beings live in reciprocal and respectful relationships with these life-giving natural systems. So I love natural climate solutions. Love the phrase. There are always going to be challenges with implementation, and that's why we have brilliant people like Judith working on social and economic safeguards and biodiversity safeguards, for example, making sure that we get it right. Because we're still working within a system when we say natural climate solutions. We are still working within the conventional economic system that we know has its flaws, if you look at it from an environmental and conservation perspective. And so natural climate solutions themselves as a phrase is not systemic change. It doesn't equate to systemic change, but I argue incremental change, and that's valuable, that's positive. In Canada, and I know we'll talk about this a bit more as well, unanswered rights questions with regard to Indigenous rights in Canada poses a significant challenge and is slightly different from the United States and other countries around the world. But what there is, and back to the original story, that if you have a foundation of respect in a relationship where there's the introduction of natural climate solutions, it may be received in a way where there's recognition of the cultural alignment with natural climate solutions. And I can speak from personal experience. I'll never forget hearing about the 2017 study that was led by the Nature Conservancy. And the concept of natural climate solutions just resonated deeply for me and immediately as an individual, and for several reasons. So I come from a very traditional community, a very traditional, what we call First Nations in Canada, or a very traditional Indigenous community called a How's-It. It was third time the charm today for you, Chris, and you got it well that time. And we wouldn't hold it against you otherwise. Anyways, you made an effort. We appreciate that. So a How's-It. And so we're of the Nuu-chah-nulth people on the west coast of Vancouver Island, in the coastal Western Hemlock biogeoclimatic zone. We've been a part of this coastal temperate landscape for many, many thousands of years, and have a deeply rooted cultural and spirituality that belongs to the region. It is informed by the region. It is the natural laws of the region which have informed how we exist as a community and as a people in that place. And so our community and our home is in that carbon-rich coastal temperate rainforest. And it's a community that Nature United and the Nature Conservancy approached, not approached, but were invited to discuss opportunities to advance natural climate solutions with. And so we've been working in partnership for over a decade now on mutual opportunities to change forest management practices in our territories that is both beneficial to the community as well as to kind of global perspectives on conservation outcomes. And so being raised in this really traditional hereditary chieftainship system on the stories and lessons, of our ancestors and deeply rooted in our traditional knowledge, we have origin stories like seasonal harvesting practices, where strict ceremony is a very common thread. And the ceremony is all about the development and upholding of protocols between society and the natural systems which give us life. That's very similar to the mission of Nature United and the Nature Conservancy, right? Protecting and preserving the lands and waters on which all life depend. That was fundamental to our traditional governance and culture in a house. It was entirely structured around ensuring that those protocols were maintained. So everything that I know and I've been taught about our house traditional knowledge points unequivocally to the attention that we give to developing and upholding protocols with natural systems. I'll say that again, developing and upholding protocols with natural systems that give us life. And we fundamentally know that to be true. And so natural climate solutions are an opportunity, and they're critical as a part of a necessary transition for society to revalue that dependent and interconnected relationship to these natural systems which give us life. So natural climate solutions are fundamental in terms of how we make decisions for and about natural systems. And it indicates to us that we can actually make different decisions about the management of resources that yield new results that are beneficial by simply reframing how we look at the management of that ecosystem type. And so, in my opinion, the single biggest factor to boosting natural climate solutions is that reawakening of peoples and cultures around the world to the valuing of that interconnected independent relationship. Like that is the primary enabling condition that will allow us to be successful with the implementation of natural climate solutions, by simply regarding those natural systems as holding value that might not be monetized. In some places, we might have the new tools, again, like carbon, to monetize some of those values. And so reconciling these relationships and building protocols between us and systems is critical. And they can only be realized through true cooperation and more specifically, collaboration across political ideological difference. This is good to do. And we need, that's a very simple language. And we need to go down this pathway. And so, it's great to sit here and listen to Judith, someone from halfway across the world, talk very similar language. And it's great to see countries coming together to make these commitments, to uphold what might be referred to as the global south, where there's a lot of value from natural climate solutions, and invest in that and ensure that there are those economic safeguards for well-being as we move forward with implementation. So, long story to answer your question. Sometimes it's well received, sometimes it's not well received, but you can find the common ground. There are cultural connections Indigenous peoples have to the fundamental concept of natural climate solutions.
It's a terrific answer, and it makes me realize I think maybe I had this wrong way around. I thought about nature-based solutions, natural climate solutions, as being brought to Indigenous communities as an offer of how to better proceed. But in fact, listening to you, it should in some ways be the other way around, listening to Indigenous peoples who already have sustainable practices and ways of maintaining our resources that we should be learning from and maybe adapting in other contexts at a different scale. I hope I haven't exaggerated that, but it sounds like I've got it backwards, or at least I had it backwards.
Sounds like my job here is done. It's been a nice pleasure to meet you all, and I think the fundamental premise of the response, absolutely. And then if we pair that with the science and knowledge that individuals like Judith bring and organizations, we can put those things together.
Fantastic. We have a question from Anita Parlow, and I think I may start with you, Judith, on this one. She asks, do nature-based solutions include saying no to a project? Do they enable the saying of no? And how does subsistence factor in?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you very much for that. So I don't think it would involve necessarily saying no to a project, but I think it would involve seeing if it were in fact a nature-based solution. So analyzing it against the criteria, thinking of whether the project does in fact provide resilience and biodiversity benefits. And if there are potential harms, how can the project be redesigned or rethought, in particular with the participation of local stakeholders, to ensure that potential risks are being taken into account throughout the project life cycle. So I think that would be my reply. It's not necessarily saying no, but it's really taking a very good look about, what is the question this is answering. I think, looking at, again, the standard and the criteria, what is the problem that's being addressed? How can you involve the stakeholders in it? Looking at the landscape approach, or an integrated approach, and also looking at the potential social, environmental, and economic risks as well as benefits, and designing the project in a way that helps to avoid, mitigate, reduce those risks while enhancing those potential benefits.
Excellent. And Mr. Atleo, this is maybe a question for you. Juliet Shepard, who works with Arctic projects and has a consultancy, asks, how do you see the role of third-party wildfire management companies in the emerging carbon management sector? Do you see third-party business strategies as potentially nature-based? And what do you see the role of regulatory oversight can contribute in achieving nature-based solutions? Sort of the role for government, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, I think we'll have to take those two apart. Actually, speaking of the North, the way natural climate solutions have been defined actually challenges, and it needs addressing this gap in the defining of natural climate solutions. Efforts that peoples in the North and in the Arctic have been using for a very long time, who are the peoples first impacted, of course, by changing climate, to account for the traditional practices or the conservation practices that they are using to stabilize and adapt to a changing climate. And so that one of the challenges with natural climate solutions is that people might feel alienated from it because it might not align with their with their day-to-day or with their mission. And that is a gap and an issue. And I think Judith answered it earlier, that natural climate solutions are one piece of a much larger toolkit for addressing climate and biodiversity issues. And I'll reiterate, they are not, again, the silver bullet. We can learn a lot from efforts that are happening in the North, for example. And so as I've rambled on, I will try to, actually, you know what, I'll ask you, Chris, to restate so that I can get it better.
Sure. The question from Juliet Shepard was, how do third-party wildfire management companies in the emerging carbon management sector play a role? And if we're thinking about those third-party sort of corporate entities, the question also goes to regulatory bodies, governments, and how they can provide oversight to make sure that people are meeting their nature-based solutions commitments.
Ooh, yes, goodness. This is the challenge. This is a good example of the challenge. I've just taken a few notes here. So I was going to bring up fire management later. So fire management may be considered a natural climate solution if done within a certain context. There's obviously a very strong culture of fire management in Australia that is slowly making its way to the Pacific Northwest, an area, a region that I'm most familiar with, of course. We have the Tsilhqot'in national government in kind of the central interior of British Columbia, re-engaging in traditional fire management practices as a strategy for mitigating the potential impact of catastrophic wildfires that we are seeing resulting from changes to climate and from pests, etc. And so it's excellent that there are organizations and third-party organizations interested in supporting and upholding, in this case, Indigenous-led fire management practices. One of the safeguards we need with, and this is not kind of a true safeguard, this is more of an economic practice and a negotiation that we need with these third-party organizations playing a role in the development of carbon projects, is ensuring that communities can retain the autonomy over the carbon asset generated over time. So what we have in practical terms in Canada right now is a bit of a gold rush, right? So how are we producing carbon? Is there enough public funding available to build that pipeline of projects, many of which need to be led by Indigenous peoples in Canada due to the unanswered rights question. And in British Columbia, we have negotiations between First Nations and the Crown government for carbon revenue sharing, for example. How do we ensure that investors and third parties coming in with an interest in carbon don't kind of threaten the autonomy of the community and seek to gain exponentially from a community's asset that they're stewarding over time, quite simply because they had the capital to put up for the development of the project. So we need additional sources of capital, for example, to support community development of carbon offset projects, specifically in the forestry sector, whether that's burning or old growth management. And so we're looking at new models at Nature Unite and at the Nature Conservancy to provide that financing directly to communities so that they can have autonomy over the process. So that's one aspect of it. And of course, government have a role to play in carbon as well. Often, this is managed on the voluntary market. And what we need to see is an accountability around the development of compliance markets and the associated policies with compliance markets that in Canada in particular allow for the leadership of Indigenous communities in the development of carbon projects and the ownership of the right over those assets. This is unanswered in Canada right now, and I'll try to be more clear that we do not have a clear pathway to Indigenous peoples owning and managing carbon offset projects. We have negotiations between Crown governments and First Nations that, in particularly in British Columbia, where there is no recognition conclusion over the right of the asset itself, but rather an agreement to sharing in the revenue. So for our American colleagues, there is an unanswered rights question. That's how we would describe it. So there are very, very few settled treaties in Canada, which creates kind of the political dynamic of and an economic outcome of being uncertain about who owns the asset being generated, which is of course risk. And so how do we account for managing that risk? So we need improved protocols and policies that support community leadership in project development so that we can have really strong partnerships between third-party organizations looking to support and enable these outcomes on the ground. I hope that answered the question.
No, I think it did, and I have to say you are both inspiring a lot of interest from our audience. We have a queue of questions, and I'm going to ask this next one, which is directed to both of you by Megan Dixon, who's a lecturer in environmental studies. She asks, what do each of you feel about the 30% plan to protect important parts of the Earth's surface, but which, according to Garnett et al. In 2018, academic myself, I love footnotes within questions. Well done, Megan Dixon. The global importance of Indigenous lands for conservation may infringe on Indigenous rights to manage the land traditionally. So on the one hand, you have an international standard that says this is what we should be doing, but on the other hand, we have Indigenous rights that are either answered or acknowledged or not. And so how do those two interact? The big picture, and I guess that's your department, Judith, and then the Indigenous community sort of response in the tradition. So Judith, let you start, and then we'll go to Mr. Apple.
Thanks. Really interesting question. I also like the footnote in the question. So I think the 30 by 30 initiative is getting a lot of positive attention for what it's looking to do to protect 30% of the world's surfaces by 2030, but it does present a lot of potential risks and impacts if it's not planned and implemented with adequate safeguards in place, which will obviously include, as a key part, free, prior, and informed consent and appropriate consultation with Indigenous peoples and local communities as appropriate. I think this initiative in a lot of countries is actually building on efforts of Indigenous peoples to manage protected areas. There's different conservation categories for protected areas, and there's some led by Indigenous peoples. So I think there's a key focus at looking at some of the experiences, the learnings, and how those can be scaled up, and how other protected area schemes can take into account those good practices from Indigenous peoples' management of protected areas. For my work in Latin America specifically, I've seen in Peru and Colombia, for example, very good examples of protected area management that is being taken into account as these schemes are planned, the 30 by 30. So there's in the Amazon Andes area, as well as in the Congo Basin region from UNEP WCMC, we're supporting some countries, and they're planning for this process, and it's being done in a way that very strong safeguards are being integrated into the whole project design. Also within UNEP WCMC, we manage a database called Protected Planet, which works directly with national governments to register information on protected areas in countries using government's own data. And this also includes information on areas that are managed by Indigenous peoples as well as local communities. So we're looking at the topic from a few different ways, making sure that the data reflects different management types, making sure that best practices and strong safeguards are being applied, taken note of, and being integrated into schemes that we're supporting from UNEP WCMC for the 30 by 30 initiative. But I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head that it's an incredibly important aspect to pay attention to. I think what you don't want to do, obviously, with protected areas is to reduce access of local peoples to the natural resources that they use traditionally or depend on for subsistence. So these are all aspects that need to be looked at very, very carefully and closely as these schemes are planned and implemented.
Thank you for that, Dr. Walcott. Tyson, what are your thoughts on that question?
My thoughts are that was an expert answer to a very complicated challenge. And so that was the right technical answer to the question, in my humblest of opinions. And perhaps I can talk a little bit more about kind of the philosophy of it. A few notes here. So FPIC, implementation of UNDRIP, appropriate consultation and engagement, these are essential tools to achieving 30 by 30 effectively. I spoke about the idea of the unanswered rights question in Canada, and this exists around the world and will not be resolved in time for alleviating it as an issue for achieving 30 by 30 and net zero by 2050. So we have a bit of a challenge on our hands, and we have existing tools in the toolbox like FPIC, like the adoption and implementation of UNDRIP. With British Columbia, the province I live in, being the only provincial jurisdiction in Canada to have actually legislated the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I can assure you through lived experience that its implementation is incredibly challenging and complicated and will take decades to kind of resolve. And if not, it'll take forever to continue working on that relationship and navigating the intricacies of that relationship. So technically the answer has been given. One thing I do think that we're missing is the establishment of necessary new public institutions that allow for an improved relation between policymakers and Indigenous knowledge holders. Because we can't, one challenge here is that we can't get away from the locality of knowledge and of connection between peoples in place. You can't get away from that. You can't generalize that. And so we need better ways of relating to one another as these decisions are being made so that we can find common ground. So this is a very bubbly answer, but it's very true in actual practice. Relationships matter here. And so we can take these tools that Judith has mentioned, and how we implement them is really, really important. With as much time and with as much resources allocated as possible to ensure that those conversations are happening in a way that is respectful, responsible, and attuned to kind of the importance of the conversation. So we're not going to resolve everything before 30 by 30. We firmly believe that we do need 30 by 30, and unfortunately, that's as a result of whatever you want to blame. And so we need to apply these tools in a way that is very relational and build those relationships in place. And so how does that look practically when we're designing tools and approaches for establishing new protected areas, as an example, ensuring that FPIC as a line item is extremely robust, and ensuring that there are the right resources in place to offset the cost perhaps of doing the business, or to incentivize this approach. And we're learning a lot more about, and I'll end with this, IPCAs as an example. So Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and the various ways that might be defined, has a lot of potential for application around the world to help us meet 30 by 30, but with management approaches and practices that are more aligned with continued access for cultural, spiritual, or kind of conservation economy purposes. And so protection, like unequivocal protection, is still valuable, but there are approaches we can take to find that balance. And then you start to introduce those concepts and perspectives in that negotiation and in that relationship, provided it's done the right way. Something like that.
Excellent. I'm going to signal for everyone that we are running out of time, and so I won't get to all the questions I have. So I'm going to pick from just one more question for each of you, and then give you a chance to wrap up. The question I want to pose to you, Tyson, comes from Abigail Anderson, who's one of my Wilson colleagues. And she notes that across Indigenous communities, there is a vast traditional knowledge relevant to nature-based solutions that could help address climate challenges in other communities. And so what is the state of networking of knowledge among different Indigenous peoples? And are there things that can be done to strengthen those networks and the communication and sharing of knowledge among people in different parts of the world?
Yeah, there are, and we're seeing a continued growth in peer-to-peer networks, knowledge sharing and learning, supported by the UN, supported by the Nature Conservancy, and many other organizations around the world. So there's a growing recognition of the need to continue to do that, and it forms a large part of our work. I think it needs to be institutionalized. I think groups, for example, like Wilson Institute, might have a role to play in bringing together thought leaders from communities and bringing together knowledge holders to share about specific subject matters. So if we start to integrate the idea of peer-to-peer networks and learning into our different business models and approaches to conservation or development, then we're starting to see that trend shift and change. It's real, it's valuable, and I think it needs to be further institutionalized.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And Judith, let me come back to you. There's a question from Annette Sales, who asks, how do concepts for nature-based solutions reconcile conflicting interests? And the one she raises is food security against the need to avoid negative land use changes. And the hot topic these days. How do you balance those?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Annette, for the great question. So I think there's many different ways of balancing them. It is a very important challenge to keep in mind, but if you think about a landscape approach, consultation with local stakeholders, thinking about the trade-offs, I think there are some tools in the arsenal that could be deployed as appropriate. For example, thinking about agroforestry approaches, shade-grown coffee and cacao, having intensified cattle grazing in smaller areas of land so that you don't need to cut down as much forest. There's some really interesting schemes, for example, in Argentina that have cattle grazing integrated into forests as part of their sustainable management of forests. And that's something in the Chaco region, which is one of the ecosystems at greatest risk of being destroyed at the moment, and also has risks related to fires. So I think there's very much context-specific, ecosystem-specific, stakeholder-specific solutions that could be looked at that do keep in mind the needs local communities, local partners, of governments, businesses as well, but also keeping in mind biodiversity benefits, resilience, and longer term implications of not implementing nature-based solutions. I think if we look at a world without nature-based solutions, we're looking at a world that won't be able to make the Paris Agreement commitments. And I think, it's very important. Tyson has mentioned before as well about private sector and businesses. And I think, investment in nature-based solutions, from a recent report on the UNEP State of Finance for Nature, it found that they need to triple in real terms by 2030 if the world is to meet climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation targets. So it's a combination of looking at that planning, seeing what local practices might be appropriate to meet multiple targets in a landscape approach, considering participation with local communities, local partners, but also ensuring that there's appropriate investment from governments as well as the private sector.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give each of you just a chance to give us a last word, a thought to take away that we might want to ponder. I hope this is the first of many conversations, but as people have encountered this idea, maybe for the first time in listening to both of you, an idea, a food for thought, a takeaway that you might present. Let me start, as we did at the top of the program, with you, Dr. Walcott. Any thought that you'd like to leave with us?
I think it relates to what I was recently saying, that investing in nature gives a good return. It supports health, improves quality of life, it can help create jobs, but it's needed to have this change in mindset to create and support and sustain this economic system that places the financial value in nature and recognizes the role of nature in human prosperity, and does so in a way that it's not leaving people behind, but actually involving local communities, Indigenous peoples, other local stakeholders all along the way to find these solutions that take account of trade-offs, both short-term and longer term, to find appropriate solutions.
Excellent. And Tyson, what would you send us away with?
Yeah, along the similar lines, there was a question earlier that I failed to answer the second half of, which was regards to systems. And as I mentioned earlier as well, that natural climate solutions don't necessarily represent a full systemic change in how we manage natural resources within the context of our current economy. Judith mentioned unsustainable economic trajectories, and these are major conversations that we need to be having that are often swept to the side while we focus on kind of near-term wins for conservation outcomes that can theoretically yield economic co-benefits that maintain us on a status quo approach to unsustainable growth. And so we can't lose sight of that conversation and quite simply kind of band-aid over some of the natural climate solutions ideas. And then finally, for me, building off what Judith said, the co-benefits of natural climate solutions are critical. And from my work at Nature United and Nature Conservancy, the integration of the outcomes for biodiversity, in my opinion, are understated, often under-researched, or there's limited narratives for addressing why the biodiversity outcomes are so significant. If we can shift that mindset slightly from what's in it for me to what's in it for biodiversity outcomes, I think we're on the right path.
Well, thank you very much for that. It falls to me to thank everyone for their time and participation. Dr. Judith Walcott of the UN Environmental Program, Mr. Tyson Atleo from Nature United in Canada, and our viewers, and some great questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. I also want to put a special shout out to Newmont Corporation, a mining company that encouraged us to take a harder look at nature-based solutions, and I think it's been a very profitable discussion as a result. Thanks to the Wilson AV team, but most of all, thanks to all of you who are watching today. I hope this is the first conversation of many, and that you'll join us again for something similar, but maybe some new people soon. All right, thank you very much.